The story unfolds at a time when it was early spring, raining from the heavens, giving the world shades of freshness. An overturned carriage lies on the wet road, its broken windows glinting in the rain. There are puddles on the ground from the rain, reflecting the leaves of the trees and the overhanging clouds. But not only that, there are blood stains among this beauty, like red paint stains on a white sheet of paper. Next to the puddle lies a purple-colored hair wet from the rain with bloodstains. The villain Gabriella is lying on the ground, her eyes fixed on the sky as if she is searching for answers, her purple hair carelessly scattered on the ground like dark waves. Her dress is stained with blood. The girl lies unmoving as if frozen in a moment of memory. That's exactly what led to her death, the girl thought, instantly realizing that she was dying. Suddenly Gabriella heard a male voice say, "Lady!" A young boy came up to her, seeing her in a pool of blood. He asked, "Why?" His voice sounded uncertain and bewildered, for he did not understand what was happening. The guy said, "Live." He expressed his desire for Gabriella to survive, even if their fates were not tied, which is why he pretended as if he didn't know anything. His words carried the hope of a new beginning and a continuation of life despite what had happened. The boy crouched down next to Gabriella and lifted her off the ground, holding her head with his hand. He looked at her with a sad gaze. The girl lay still, her thoughts drifting away, and she thought, "I wish the sun would shine today." Her hand barely touched the puddle that had formed next to her because of the rain. The guy sat next to the girl and asked only one question. Why? Why is she now? His words expressed incomprehension and concern. At this moment, Gabriella reflected that if only the sun were shining, the boy's face wouldn't look so sad. The sun's rays could have illuminated his facial expression, making it more joyful. The guy who hugged Gabriel? Ernst Cassel Eckes. The one who commands the forces of the night. The leader who guides his loyal, mighty army. And husband of the holy villain Gabriella. It all started with a treaty, a novella called Marching for the True Saint. The girl suddenly found herself in the body of the villain Gabriella. The girl was frightened and surprised at the same time. She immediately began to remember the plot, which, as it seemed to her, was now part of her own life. The girl scrutinized herself in the mirror, but she did not recognize herself in the face and figure reflected in it. The mirror reflected an unknown woman, and her identity became a mystery that she had to solve in this story. The Count gives birth to an illegitimate daughter, Gabriella, and she lives like an angel, personifying purity and tenderness. But the real story turns out to be quite the opposite. Gabriella only blamed and tormented, revealing her dark side. And in the end she faced death, completing her difficult journey in the life of a novelist. Realizing that Gabriella didn't want to die, the girl pounded on the mirror with her fists, expressing her desire and determination to live. Yeah, she just wanted to survive and didn't want to die. It's hard to live when you know you're going to die. The real-life heroine suddenly remembered what she had read about Gabriella before her rebirth, and an announcement from the author of the novella popped into her head. This memory was in its own way a clue that could help her understand how she ended up inside this story, and how she was connected to Gabriella. Author's announcements. Her next work is Marching in the Name of the True Saint, and she is currently writing a story about a fake marriage and a cold North Sea man. Gabriella began to ponder, and remembered that if it was about the North Sea, it probably meant that it was about Duke Ernst, the main character in the story. The author had warned her that the story wasn't finished, and the plot could change. This gave her hope. The girl asked herself questions. Is it bad to be the protagonist? And is it possible to be happy being in the body of the villain Gabriella? After all, happiness can be found in unexpected places. The tragic scene brings us back to Gabriella, wounded and sitting on the ground, next to her husband Ernst. The girl remarks that she had long guessed what was going to happen. It is at this point that a voice comes from behind them, announcing that they have caught Kusera, who has escaped, who admitted to damaging a carriage wheel and having the banner of the power of the day discovered on his back. Ernst guesses that the first prince is behind all this. The coachman objects fiercely. Ernst says they need to be sure to find whoever is behind this, and after that, consider severe punishments, including chopping off his hands and even both legs, making him crawl for the rest of his life. It It was the first time the girl had seen Ernst so intimidating and ruthless as he discussed punishments for Kucher. Though it was an efficient marriage, the Duke was always kind to her. First, the contract required them to pretend to love each other for years. Secondly, they are forbidden to fall in love for real. Third, after the divorce, they wouldn't be together. Despite these conditions, the 3 years of marriage were happy. She was afraid that she would accidentally reveal her feelings and worried a lot. She wanted to give it to him until the end of the treaty, so he wouldn't have to bow down to the royal family anymore. But she never thought she'd just die. But she was able to keep the family heirloom he gave her as a wedding present. When things started to happen and the coachman started to break into the carriage, the girl guessed what would happen next. She quickly took the ring off her finger and swallowed it so that no one would get it and she could keep it safe. This is a beautiful and valuable treasure of the X family, a ring that defies fire. Made of noble gold, it is adorned with a blue emerald stone in the very center of the ring. And on either side it is adorned with red rubies, giving it even more splendor. This treasure was a true symbol in the Eckes family. The girl tried to tell Ernst that she knew where the ring was, but he insisted that there was no need to say anything. She realized she had the ring and it wasn't gone, but she couldn't put it into words. Her whole body ached. Guy touched her forehead and felt it burning. He asked her to take care of her health and begged her not to talk. Gabriella said she was sorry to have to leave him with such horrible memories. Thank you for coming to check on her and not letting her die alone. She hopes that they will meet again in the next life, that this separation is temporary, and their fates will intertwine again in the future. When the girl's eyes closed in that life, something extraordinary happened, as if time itself had changed its course. She heard a loud sound uttered by a man who said, "You are listening." Opening her eyes, she realized that this moment seemed like some kind of transition or opportunity to start over. She realized she was sitting in a chair, and her first thoughts were filled with questions about what was going on. After all, she was going to die in an accident, and that was certain. Looking around, she realized that she was in the Lord of the Great Hall. But why was she here if she was dead? Why were the forces of day and night gathered in one place? Had they, reunited? She wondered what was even going on, hoping for an answer or clarification to this strange situation. The priest went on to say today, they are officially concluding the marriage between Duke Eckes and the princess. Her Highness the Princess will leave for the north in 3 days' time. The girl wondered if he was talking about Mr. X. That would be her husband Ernst. And how is it that there is a marriage between him and the princess? Her reaction was quite natural. Everything that was happening seemed unbelievable to her. Her heart beat as if it were about to burst apart under the pressure of strange and incomprehensible feelings. Had she really stood up as Princess Fiona Isodium? The girl sensed that something was wrong. She started groping and examining herself, and realized that her hair color was completely different from what she expected. This was an incredible discovery to her, and she continued to barb to herself under her breath. Did she really become Princess Fiona? The priest said if there's no objection, he'd like to proceed with the signing. The priest who showed the princess, now Fiona, signing the treaty there at the table. To sign the contract, he asks Mr. X to sign it as well. X answered yes and began to study the prenuptial agreement. Fiona looked at him and said that he was her Ernst. At that moment she realized that despite the change of circumstances, she recognized him as her husband. Fiona looked at Ernst carefully, remembering the outline of his face, his eyes, his hair. She found that he looked the same as he had in her previous life. The priest drowned the princess so that she would sign the marriage contract. Fiona looked down at the contract and saw that it was a wedding vow, and the date was April 6th, 826th year. It's been 6 years since Gabriella's death, so today is exactly 1 year since she died. Fiona thought you were signing this document of vows she was his wife again. But the catch was that he hates her because she's the king's daughter. The girl wondered if she should tell him she was Gabriella, because before she died she begged to see me again, and here she is. She tried to say something, but she couldn't say a word. She grabbed a pen and tried to write on the paper that she was his ex-wife Gabriella, but she couldn't write the name Gabriella either. But why? And how is she supposed to give him a sign? It's like some kind of spell. She's gonna have to live in this Fiona's body. And the problem is that this princess is her husband's sworn enemy, kingdom. It had long been divided by the two forces of the power of day and the power of night. Powers of the day, they represent the affluent south loyal to the royal family. The powers of the day just love the arts, culture, and horseback riding. The forces of the night, they too love the arts, culture, and horseback riding and are spread across the desert north. They are united and act under the orders of the Grand Duke. The two forces have completely different lifestyles, culture, and religion, and there is no reason for marriage. Then why the fake marriage now? When the contract was signed, everyone went back to their rooms, and Fiona went to her room, sitting on the ottoman and looking at the dress she would be wearing for the next 3 days after leaving the palace. The girl looked at the dress and thought that the king's sudden insistence on joining the two forces was actually a good deal. Especially for the North, Ernst. The girl hesitated and slowed her words. Running her hand over her dress, she felt the fabric beneath her fingers, as if touching something real that reminded her of her past life with Ernst. Today she saw his face after a long separation, but his expression was terribly cold. Fiona began to think about the fact that Ernst was probably not too happy about this new marriage. She wondered if he would remember his ex-wife, Gabriella, forever. Memories and feelings could stay with a person for a long time, and this added complexity to their new relationship and marriage. The girl squeezed her eyes shut and thought that no, this was no time to be sad. He was so cold to Fiona, not because of her. He's just hated the royal family since he was a kid. So she hopes Ernst's grim expression and cold stare aren't because of Gabriella. The girl cried, putting her head on the mannequin with the dress. She was sorry, she thought, but even if he doesn't want this marriage, she's glad they met again. Maybe she's selfish, but she hopes he ate well without her. He used to forget to eat a lot, and he'd get a job. Maybe he can't even eat properly at a wedding. At least the servants used to bring food to the office and remind him to eat. She doesn't know how it is now, but she misses him very much. While the girl was enjoying the memories, a maid came into the room shouting, "Lady, she's here." The maid had a box with a lot of thread in it. The maid came up to Fiona and told her to stand up straight because she'd lost so much weight she'd have to measure Italy again. Fiona felt a sense of surprise when the maid dared to speak to her like that. It would have displeased and perplexed Fiona, for such a tone was not in keeping with her status as a princess. Thanks to her bodily memory, she was aware of how things had been with Fiona since she was born, and knew that even the maids had bullied her. Now she was faced with the same situation, when the maid ordered her to stand still and raise her hands. Fiona Isodium's story had been full of humiliation and indifference to her since childhood. However, the girl's consciousness began to move into Fiona's body a week ago, and eventually it finally entered this body. During this entire period, Fiona lay in bed, and no one paid any attention to her. Her status was shameful, and she faced misunderstanding and indifference from those around her. The rumors, which were most likely started by one of the brothers claiming the throne, began to spread for the first time. Fiona thought she had managed to survive, because no one was interested in her, and no one was interested in her fate. Her foolish brother probably thought he could kill her at any moment, but she stayed alive. While she was pondering and remembering what had happened to Fiona in all this time, the maid was busy measuring the dress to be tailored. The girl realized that she would have to play the role of fool and be careful. Even though she certainly didn't deserve to be treated and neglected like that, Fiona decided to ask the maid why she cared about the dress and not about her own life. The maid didn't understand, and in a hurry, she asked what was the matter. Fiona said she was sorry, but there was something waiting for her. The maid asked what was what. Fiona replied she would die within the hour. The maid stood up and asked what she was talking about. "How is that dying?" All she answered, "Because she's a very brazen maid. The pearls represent the bride's departure feast, but she switched them." The girl laughed and said that if it got out, she'd die. The maid looks at Fiona with great surprise and then screams, "Yeah, she doesn't even know if they're real or not." Fiona asked the maid to tie up her dress so she'd be even more beautiful. The maid lowered her head to the floor and asked if Fiona had told anyone about this. Fiona turned to her and asked, "Does she want her to tell the other maids?" The maid shouted, "No! Maybe she wants her to tell the king that the pearl has strangely disappeared somewhere else." The maid kept yelling that she didn't have to. It wasn't her doing. She said she didn't care, so the other maids stole. The maid asked how the other maids were doing. When we thought about it, if we cut out her tongue, she can't even blame it on the other maids. She's their accomplice, so we have to do things differently. Then she told the maid that she was a fool, for the wedding dress could not be changed. They thought that even if she realized it would be too late to change anything, they decided that she would not notice if the pearls were stolen. The girl knew how many times Fiona had been used like this before. She clapped her hands together and said, "First we should ask her brother what she looks like. He'll probably say she's beautiful without pearls." And the girl rushed for the door, but the maid stopped her, saying, "Wait, lady." Fiona asked her, "Come on, who else should she blame next?" The maid said she'll return all the pearls because there's still time. When all she asked what time, she was talking about how she knew they hadn't been sold yet. The maid immediately mumbled and didn't know what to say. She's realized she's very stupid, but she could really use it. Then Fiona told the maid to kneel down and pointed her finger at the floor. The maid was surprised at what? I think she said it again today. She needs help. She wants her to help her. Then Fiona said, "Well, she'll go to her brother and tell him she'll marry without the pearls. You see, the maid helped the other maids and shared the pearls with them." "Right, because that's what you have to tell your brother." The maid screamed again. No, she was still hiding where she'd made those pearls. But then she humbly fell to her knees and said to give her another chance. She begged for it. Fiona began to give a little chuckle at her, saying, "Why is her chin up so high?" Then the maid put her head to the floor and said she was sorry. She was consumed by greed and begged you to forgive her. Have mercy on her. Fiona said she'd forgive her, but the maid must be loyal and faithful to her. And she told her to have the maid escort her to Ernst. She admires the maid very much. If she doesn't want to go, she can go to the prison and get another maid then. Fiona said the maid would have to choose between loyalty and imprisonment for stealing, and the girl screamed yes, she would be faithful to her. Fiona asked then what her name was, and the maid said her name was Sonia. Fiona walked over to her and said yes. Sonia stroked her head, ruffling all her hair, continued that she would now serve Lady Fiona. Fiona was determined that she would make sure everyone got what they deserved. And this is her thanks to Fiona for the body, a revenge bouquet, so to speak. A couple days later, it was beautiful sunny weather. Outside, the carriage was already harnessed up, and Fiona's family was saying goodbye to her because she was leaving for Ernst's house. "Oh," said Fiona's brother Senior. Fiona's heart constricts at the mere thought of his dear sister's departure. "Eldest brother, this is the first Prince Tudwig Freiken Esodium." That the engine said not to worry, the royal guard would escort her to Dalton Harbor. There were a few girls on the horizon who were trying to shout and flirt with her older brother. Fiona said she thanked her brother. She looked at him and thought, does anyone really think he's handsome in person? She only sees greed on his face. Tudwig is a greedy man with his hands in everything. He's even tried to steal the sacred relics of other families, and he's the one who ordered Gabriella to be disposed of. Fiona's fist clenched and she wanted to answer him. But thinking that she should act like Fiona, the girl tried to calm herself down, inhaling, exhaling, not to give in to her emotions, thinking about the main goal. But today the mind of the Grand Duchess of X's is still alive. It is very difficult for her to fight her emotions, but she tries her best to hold back. Tudwig said he was sorry he wouldn't accompany his sister to the end, but he exhaled when he learned that the third prince would be traveling with her. "Your blood brother and sister, aren't you?" Fiona thought Tudwig never liked her, so he always talked to her like that. Although ensuring proper arrival at the duchy is important, thinks he was just forced into it because he couldn't get a place in the royal palace. The third prince, Johannes Mimil Isodium. He has a good height and build. He's only a year older than Fiona. I wonder how long that pink sweet fluffy will last in the Northern Fleet. Johannes said sister she must be careful, while Tudwig told her to remember to send her brother's news. She answered. Good thought to herself that the conversation was finally over. She smiled and said that Fiona would do anything, she would never forget her brothers. Big brother said smart Fiona thought he was talking to that creepy man. As a flashback came in today, standing there is her older brother and a younger Fiona. He told her that it would be great if she always spoke in third person. The former Fiona answered well and spoke to herself in the third person. It seems there are still memories in her body. The first prince must have spread silly rumors about her. The girl had goosebumps and thought he was some kind of pervert. She couldn't believe she had to talk about herself in the third person in public. She'd rather drown herself, but she had to hold on. She still had some work to do. As the girl suddenly thought of a plan in her head, when suddenly Fiona said if the brother knew that Fiona wanted to thank him. Of course he was surprised to be asked why. Fiona put her arm around Ernst's shoulder and said, yes. She never thought she would marry such a handsome man. And then the girl clapped her hands and started spinning around in circles, grabbing the edges of the dress so you can clearly see the patterns and designs on it. Fiona screams, look at the beautiful dress. Fiona screams that it's a real pearl. It's beautiful because real pearls are shimmering on Sveta. Nearby stood people, women who admired Auntie, and they themselves began to discuss that the first prince did not spend a fortune on the dress. He's not even related to the princess. They're not even blood relatives. He told everyone he'd take care of his sister. Fiona had an idea that she should be ashamed not only of herself, but also of her older brother. She wondered if a prince could be so openly mocked. Where's the second principal? Fiona wondered. But it's a good thing it's not there now. Fiona used to flinch like a frightened mouse when a second prince came around. This body only remembers the fears of what will happen to Fiona when she confronts the second prince for real. The girl noticed that Ernst looked at her and didn't like the look very much. I think he looked at her and frowned, but he immediately realized his position. Elder brother Tudwig called the butler and asked him what he thought he had asked for, that the dress be adorned exclusively with pearls. The butler bowed and replied he had checked. No less than once it seems they had been switched already in the palace, probably the handiwork of the maids. Tudwig angrily told him to shut up. He realized he'd made a mistake. Fiona grabbed her maid Sonia and asked, "Brother, can she take this maid with her? She doesn't like the other maids, only this one is suitable." Tudwig replied, "I guess he can provide it as a wedding gift." Fiona replied, "Wonderfully, it suits her." Then her brother came to her and put his hands on her shoulders and told her to be happy, sister. If her husband bothers her, she can send him a message. Fiona noticed how he squeezed her shoulders, and her shoulders were red and incredibly painful. But she tolerated it. She told herself that she should smile and not show weakness. It's just a game and the main scene isn't over yet. By some miracle or conduction, Ernst came up and said he apologized, Your Highness, for taking Fiona's hand. Now he would take good care of his wife himself. Ernst said he was sorry, but they had a long journey ahead of them. Goodbye, and he put his hand on Fiona's shoulder. The girl immediately felt that warm feeling. She knew he might seem indifferent, but he cares for Fiona. He's the kind of man who doesn't care about the formalities of high society. He cares about nothing, but he has perfect manners. So like no one else who gave the girl his hand as she entered the carriage and said, "May I?" It's like he's telling everyone he's going to keep treating her with respect. Fiona gave him her hand with great pleasure, and past feelings came over her at once, because he was once her husband, and she knows how he can treat a man. Her heart is about to jump out of her soul. She can't even breathe looking at him. She thought she'd never see him again after she died. For the last couple days she's been worried it was just mirage. She didn't think she'd be Ernst's wife again. What a miracle. A tear fell from a girl's eye and he asked her what was wrong. She said that he didn't realize she was Gabriella, but that she was with him. The girl climbed the steps and got into the carriage. He said it was time to go, and the coachman replied, "Yes, Your Grace." Fiona was very surprised that she knew it wasn't the only carriage, but he decided to ride along with her. Fiona kept replaying in her head every move Ernst made as he gave her his hand as she sat down. It was very nice of him to touch her, and the girl had shivers all over her body. He has no reason to ride in the same carriage as her, but he seems to want to protect a weak princess, and that's saying something. He probably wanted to make sure she didn't fall into the first prince's trap, because it's impossible not to love a man like him. At last the carriage set off, and Fiona looked out of the window. She just cheered in her heart. She couldn't shout at the whole carriage, but she was very glad that at last she was free from the clutches of the first prince and the whole kingdom. As the carriage drove away, the girl saw everyone left behind, first the prince's older brother. Now she could return to her heart's native land. She just couldn't believe it when she saw herself in the reflection of the carriage glass and shuddered. Every time she looks at herself in the mirror, she is surprised as if for the first time. She can't get used to this look, because she is Fiona now. Those cat-green eyes, rounded eyebrows emphasizing a sharp look, smooth porcelain skin and rosy cheeks emphasizing the youthfulness of a girl of 23. Her beauty is simply dazzling, like the first days of fall when the leaves begin to shimmer in all shades of gold. Yes, her face was now a real work of art, the girl thought, smiling a little. She wondered if she could keep that innocence forever. Gabriella was a villain, so she acted like a wicked and cunning woman. Fiona suddenly thought that if there were any questions about Gabriella's death, the first question would be who killed her. Ernst has probably already found out. It's possible it was the first prince, or the second prince doesn't know if he's cunning enough to use such tactics. The first prince is trying to win the battle for the throne, He's very interested in the ancient treasures and artifacts. Considering the fact that his target was the gems, he probably planned to kill her because of it. The second question is, why did she go to the future, and not the past and not her own body? Shouldn't she have gone back in time and used the knowledge of the future to reunite with her husband? And she could have. And didn't Gabriella swallow the ring? We'll have to find out when they get to the Hermitage, Fiona thought. And the third question is, where is Fiona? Okay. The only thing that really matters now is that Gabriella or Fiona is Ernst's wife again. Fiona will not let her die again, and they will live happily ever after this time. The girl will have to give the ring to Ernst. As far as she understood from the meeting, Ernst obviously hasn't figured it out yet. And even if he did, it wouldn't change anything. Part of her wants to sit down and talk, but she can't. She can't just stand up and say she's Gabriella, because something's keeping her from saying the word as soon as she's about to. What the hell? Fiona thought. There he is, sitting across the table. You have to tell him everything. He's so close, yet so far away. The carriage continued along the winding road that led deep through the forest. With every meter they traveled, the forest grew thicker and thicker, and the trees stretched upward. Multicolored leaves glided across the carriage window. The carriage itself was decorated with delicate flowers that gave it an exquisite look, like a fairy tale work of art. At the back of the carriage was a huge vase overflowing with colorful flowers, creating a vibrant palette of colors. As the carriage moves, a gorgeous vase is placed on the back where the carriage is set up. The flower petals gradually begin to crumble. They fall to the ground, creating a soft, wonderfully colorful carpet of petals. As the carriage traveled down the road, the melodic clatter of the wheels on the ground created a distinct rhythm that reminded Fiona of the sound of the sea. The spring breeze touched her face affectionately, bringing coolness and freshness with it. In that moment, it was as if she had been transported back to the day when the smooth waves churned the seashores, where every step leaves footprints in the sea sand. That was the day she confessed her feelings for him. He answered nothing, and she was silent. There was only silence between them. For her, there was only him and their breathing in unison. Fiona misses immensely the times when everything seemed possible and the world was full of incredible beauty. But first she has to get rid of the magical shackles and tell him she's in Fiona's body. Oh wait, shackles. She's heard of this somewhere before. There's no way that's possible, Fiona thought in surprise. That's right. The girl remembered reading about it in the short story March in the Name of the True Saint. The main character was also struck down by a spell. In that world, she had a limited role too. Fiona remembered reading about it, and there was a mention of it. So the heroine Ingrid goes to some kind of heaven where her angel boyfriend tells her she has a limited role. Angel says her role was sent by God, and every hero has a purpose. If she fulfills it in a certain amount of time, the shackles will be removed. Ingrid asked for a little more detail. Doesn't she understand anything? The angel said, well, it wasn't that hard, taking out the book and handing it to Ingrid. He added that he could show her if necessary. Ingrid picked up a book and read it, and when she opened it she saw that it was in Korean. Ingrid thought that it was quite difficult to write an ancient book in a foreign language. The girl began to search for the necessary information in the book. When I found it, I told it an exception, so it pointed a finger. Ingrid Weibel, she's under a long-term spiritual spell. Ingrid questioned the spiritual. How is that? The angel replied that to remove it, you had to play your part. Ingrid asked in surprise that the angel replied he calls it the Salpuri dance. But just so you know, if you fail, the spell won't be broken, thought. And when that crazy god takes off the shackles when she gets to the right moment, the angel put the hood over his head and said that no one knows but it will be soon. So would she like to go with him? He wants to enjoy the beautiful view. It was written in the novel itself. That's how our protagonist exclaimed when she remembered reading it on her phone. To free herself from the shackles that keep her from saying she's Gabriella, she needs to play that character for a while. I mean Fiona. She was Gabriella the villain playing nice, but the villain was on the verge of death. Maybe that's why she ended up in Fiona's body. Fiona was the most appropriate character to reveal Gabriella Nashert's character. Gabriella was a skinny, weak Gabriella from a long time ago, who cried a lot and pretended to be an angel. She pretended to be innocent. Okay, Fiona thought. She'll do it. She'll smile sweetly and say whatever is expected of her. She'll put up with any surprises. We'll pretend not to know anything and play innocent. He'll play the character perfectly. break free of the shackles and tell all about it. That was the girl's plan, because she misses her husband very much, her friends and acquaintances, and she really loves Ernst. The heroine realizes that this kind of plot is important to the story, and it adds deep sensual undertones to the story and makes it more heartfelt. Ernst broke the silence and said that when she arrived at the palace, she would be assigned the East Wing to live there with her maids. Fiona noticed that he was cold. Well, it wouldn't work on the first try, and there's no need to be nice. The girl got a little upset. Although he wasn't so aloof before, his eyes and voice have deepened and become more serious over the years. The guy asked his face because he noticed Fiona was staring at him without even blinking. The girl tensed up a little at the question, asked she didn't know what to say because she realized she was staring at him. But then Milo laughed and said, "No, it's okay." The guy said, well, Fiona thought he must have been worried to tell her, and Fiona decided to see how he would react to her question. She asked with a smile on her face why her husband was so cold, but there was silence, and he didn't say anything or raise an eyebrow. Fiona thought she'd bury herself, and it was a risky move to ask. As Ernst suddenly asked, "Did she do it on purpose then?" Fiona realized that then it was when she twirled around in her dress and pointed out to everyone that her brother had cheated. She asked Ernst if she shouldn't have done it. After all, she realized that she couldn't tell him that it was on purpose, and had just asked a stupid question. She heard Ernst say, "No." Fiona realized that Ernst had agreed to the marriage because Fiona was not the most seductive girl. If she were someone a little smarter, someone who could hurt the North, she wouldn't have agreed to this alliance. As frustrating as it is, she has to keep playing the fool. But she thought of a way out of it, and smiled slightly and looked at her husband, and then said, "These clothes are terribly uncomfortable." Ernst said, "Huh? He didn't think of that. Is your dress too tight?" Fiona replied, "Yes, she is extremely uncomfortable sitting in it, very tight corset. She can't even take a proper breath." Ernst said he could stop the carriage and call the maids, but the girl said no, in answer to him. She does not want to get up from the bench of the carriage. She came very close to Ernst and said that maybe he himself could help loosen her corset. Fiona decided that just because she doesn't know anything doesn't mean she has to sit around and do nothing. But he looked at her with a very cold look and said, "Let him stop the carriage and tell the maid to help you." Fiona was upset for a minute because of what she'd heard. She even wished they'd stop the carriage and have the maids help her. They were Ernst. She thought maybe he'd recognize her if she looked like Gabriella, but she didn't. The girl said okay and went to sit in her seat in the carriage. She knew it was normal that Ernst didn't recognize her. How could anyone recognize a person in another body? And even if you couldn't give a hint in any way. He's blinded by hatred and rumors given what's going on. He's partially understandable. He doesn't know that Gabriella is in Fiona's body. Plus he knows she's Princess Fiona from the Forces of the Day family he so despises. She wondered if it would be too much for her to live in the East Wing. The East Wing is the building for annoying guests. The place is beautiful, but it is too far away from the main building. Their engagement had been celebrated in the North long ago, but it had been announced that they would not live as a couple. The girl threw her arms back and untied the tightly tied dress herself. She thought that if it was Ernst's wish, she couldn't just go to the annex. She had to leave quietly and pretend she didn't know. Sooner or later, he's going to find out the truth. And she's going to make sure he finds out. The carriage has arrived in the forest where the tents are already pitched. They will have to spend 2 days camping on Ernst's business. Ernst's tent. The guy is sitting at the table burning candles in a candlestick. He is studying the documents. There was a voice commander in the tent came in the guy. But not immediately. He was scrutinizing the document he had in his hand. Then he looked up and saw whoever had come into the tent and said it seemed to be a success. Sebastian Deason, the chief aide to the commander, entered the tent. The guy was in a great mood. And smiling, he said that he could say with certainty that yes, they worked hard and did a good job. The cargo was delivered by the rest of the team and placed on the ship. Ernst said good job sitting down in a chair to converse with his assistant. So the transportation of at least some of it was necessary to solve the military issue, but mostly it was necessary for civilians. Those who were witnesses in the trial to overthrow the first prince. This has been the original plan since the marriage. Only the most loyal elite are privy to the mission, including Sebastian. He's the one who stole his wife, and the one he's been looking for 6 years. It's a way to get rid of the first prince. Ernst took the cup of tea that Sebastian had prepared to sip and enjoy the tea. But it didn't work at all, and the guy just choked and spit out the tea and said that's how he learned to make proper tea. Smiled, and said he thought he was much better than the lady at making that tea anyway. By the way, the anniversary of her death is coming up. She'd love it if he left a gift on her grave. Ernst mouthed with a handkerchief, because from when coughing up tea slurped and said, Sebastian, he needs to watch what he says. Sebastian 5 laughed and said he screwed up. Okay. Sebastian said, didn't he say the princess claims everything is fine? They need to show her their gratitude. Ernst said, yes, but he's having a hard time accepting it. Sebastian turned and said, Commander, you yourself know how much they respected his wife. Said yes, he knows. He said he also knew that the 4th princess would not harm the North. He had studied her carefully. Sebastian began to talk about how Princess Fiona is a kind, strong-minded, but socially withdrawn princess. She has no more mental capacity than a child. She has not even been able to learn the norms of behavior in high society. The 2nd prince has been bullying her since she was a child. Moreover, she suffers from sleepwalking. Ernst interrupted Sebastian and said that he had no intention of finding a woman after Gabriella's death, and Princess Fiona he approved of because she's not the smartest, say she's no smarter than a child. He took her as a revenge wife, but he's going to keep her like a little sister for the rest of his life. He wonders if she's just like the rumors. Into the tent burst one of the knights. He shouted, Commander started with himself. Sebastian got up and said he would go, and you, Ernst, rest and sort out those papers. Finally, Sebastian said that, speaking of privacy, tonight is your wedding night. Ernst thought that even after all these years he was very tired. The guy grabbed his head because it ached. Sitting on the edge of the couch, he thought he'd close his eyes and prepare himself for tomorrow. The guy thought Gabriella through. She'd be disappointed in him if she found out he married for revenge, because he agreed to this alliance to be able to move freely through the territory of the forces of the day, use the princess to get closer to the first principal. But there are other excuses. He doesn't have the words to justify it. He has a very bad headache, and he sits there all the time rubbing his head with thoughts. 6 years is a long time, and he still thinks of her when he closes his eyes. He remembers little things like the corners of her smile, her pale cold skin and soft body warm, and never to see her again. He was in terrible pain, because that ominous day he couldn't protect her, and she died in front of him. He sat in the rain for a long time and never left her side. He came as soon as he read her letter, but he could not prevent her death. The thought of it plunges him into despair every time. He tries to remember every detail of her death. Every rainy day he visits the place where she died. How the rain sounded that day. How desolate the earth was. How scarlet was the blood that spread beneath the carriage. How cold her body became when she drew her last breath. He would never forget her heavy breathing. He promised. The man responsible for the murder and those involved in the crime would have their heads cut off. At that very moment, Fiona entered the tent, saying she apologized if she was interrupting. But she sees that he's thinking about something, so she calls out again and says, Ernst, is he here? A few minutes before Fiona came to Ernst's tent. Fiona had 2 tents pitched by her maids, but the girl was in a carriage this evening. She sat there thinking it's impossible to have a romantic first night in a marriage like this. I guess it's normal on a camping trip. He must have done it on purpose. Otherwise, they would have had to stay in the same room alone. No, she's happy to see Ernst reject other women, but she doesn't know whether to laugh or cry. Near the carriage, Sonia was sitting eating food, and Fiona saw her and called out to her, saying that Sonia was... The maid jumped up in a second and asked, Yes. Miss Fiona asked her if she knew where the Duke was now. Fiona crumpled her food she was eating in her fist and said, I don't know, but she's about to find out. The maid ran off in a flash towards the others' tents to find out where the Duke was. Fiona, watching, thought her maid was quick after all. And at least she realizes what Fiona saved from her life. The girl is left alone. She thought about what she sees, that he wants to be around, and wants to be in a good relationship. But it's not like she's striving for unwavering loyalty. Fiona didn't have time to finish her thoughts before the maid came running in screaming, Princess! Princess! She found him! It was like that before Fiona entered Ernst's tent. She came in with a genuine smile and offered to let him make her a cup of tea. She was very pleased that she had managed to sneak in. She didn't like the look on his face, but she's not going anywhere. The guy held his head up and said, Princess, don't bother. Fiona noticed that there were 2 cups of tea on the table. She thought it looked like he'd already had it. Don't tell me Sebastian made it. It must be bad. Fiona said she noticed he seems to like tea since you're off the cup. But the guy replied, no need. Then she thought how she could get away with it and said could she make herself a cup of tea. But Ernst said to tell the maid to do it. So Fiona said she could drink it here. But the boy said she could do it in the carriage. Doesn't want to drink tea outside. And said she was hated by everyone, letting out a small tear, a so-called eye attack. Fiona hoped for the best, melted and said, drink your tea and go to bed immediately. Fiona was glad to have some time with him. The girl, enveloped in memories of the past and inspired by the magic of the surrounding nature, began to prepare the tea. Her hands deftly and gently handled the cups and teapots, as if she were creating a real ritual. The aroma of tea began to spread, filling the air with incredible notes of herbs and flowers, as if inviting everyone around for magical moments of comfort and inspiration. Ernst watched the girl handle it all and realized that she knew tea. He'd noticed it at the Pearl incident, but he just didn't believe it. The girl enjoyed every moment of the tea-making process. As soon as the aroma began to spread, she closed her eyes, immersing herself in the world of flavors. This moment was more than just making a drink. It was a meditation, during which she was completely immersed in the aroma and flavor of the tea, enjoying every note. Was she so badly treated that she had to make her own tea? Ernst thought. No, he was not even curious about that. He wondered how a not-so-clever princess could make tea so skillfully, and why he gets a warm feeling when he sees with what elegance she handles the tea utensils. He was distraught, and Fiona, full of care and attention, prepared a cup of tea. When it was ready, she simply held the cup out to Ernst and calmly said, would you like some? There was genuine concern in her voice. The boy replied, yes, please, and there was gratitude in his voice. He realized how much she tried and cared for him, and it brought him comfort and warmth in this moment of turmoil. Fiona thought the tea should just cool down enough to drink in peace. When Ernst took a sip of tea, his face changed that taste. He thought it tasted exactly like the tea Gabriella used to make and missed. Fiona didn't think twice and asked how it was, but she prefers tea with honey. She asked Ernst if he likes to add honey. The girl finished her tea. Ernst didn't answer or say anything. Then she said the cup was empty, so she had to go. Good night. Fiona left Ernst's tent, leaving him pondering his teacup was full. The boy sat there thinking it was strange Gabrielle also liked tea with honey, which is probably what all women like, or the princess is using some kind of tactic. Why does this girl remind him so much of Gabrielle? Although maybe he's making it up and it's just a coincidence. But he's not wrong about something. Maybe that's why he keeps interacting with her. Maybe instead of putting the princess in the East Wing like he originally planned, he should keep a close eye on her. The boy had some strange feeling, as if Gabriella had been near him for a moment, and he remembered her as a respected duchess. I didn't laugh a lot, but when I turned around and gave him a smile, he couldn't stay indifferent, and in the end he had to break the terms of the contract that said not to love each other. It was a passionate love, and he was distracted by everything about her soft lips, long neck. The number of nights he remembered her all alone only increased, and the day he finally embraced her, it seemed like she was all he needed. And then it was taken away from him right away. He just wanted to be happy. Who the hell is Princess Fiona to stir up so many memories in him? Her care and attention makes him shiver, because in that moment he realizes how she so unselfishly cares for him and tries to make him kinder to her. The next day Fiona had already lounged in the carriage. The girl went out for a walk and to stretch her bones a bit to get fit, for she felt as if she had no home near her carriage. There was a small band of knights sitting around a fire. Fiona noticed they had plates of bread in their hands and were eating dinner, she thought. Only Fiona stared at them, and the guys noticed her, and they all looked at her as if she was the only one here and no one else. She thought they looked judgmental because they all looked at her without smiling. She decided to take a walk with her maid Sonia as they strolled near the carriage. She noticed where are the guards of the first prince and the third. It's terribly wrong considering the Northern Fleet is against their... And then the girl smiled and said, well, she doesn't mind. It's even easier to get around. Returning to her boys who were sitting by the fire, she heard some of them coughing. The girl said, a minute, what is it? They're all sick. What's she gonna do? Fiona called the night boys over to her place. She said, excuse me, she has some business to attend to. All the knights had a cup of tea with lemon in their hands, and one of them asked what it was, Princess. Fiona said it's honey tea. She drinks it when she has a cold. She saw you coughing, so she wanted to help. Drink it. Well, none of the knights started drinking right away. They all hesitated. The problem was they didn't trust her. Maid Sonia screamed. And what a disappointment. You can't even take tea with honey. You know how easy it is for me to make it. They used precious honey and cinnamon and even added lemon. Because those ingredients are not easy to get, they had to go to all that trouble, and they don't want to drink the tea. A couple hours before making tea with lemon and honey, Fiona held out her hand to Sonia's maid, and in her hand was a jeweled hairpin. She told the maid to take it, and showed her if she refused to give up the right ingredients. After the cooking process itself was very difficult, Maid Sonia had to stir this concoction until she was blue in the face. One of the knights said, "Okay, let's try it," and put the cup to his mouth. But one of the guys grabbed his hand and said he was serious about trying it, he wasn't afraid. But the guy said the princess wouldn't hurt them, and that guy drank a whole cup of tea with lemon and honey. He was very surprised at how good it tasted, and nothing happened to him. He insisted on living. So all the other knights lined up and Maid Sonia poured everyone a cup of tea. When the maid was pouring the tea, Sama decided to sniff from the ladle, and thought she couldn't believe they didn't want to taste it. Very tasty, nice flavor. And then the maid freaked out and said, "Don't they have anything to say for the gifts you should be grateful for?" And all the knights as one shouted, "Thank you very much, princess." Fiona smiled and thought that Sonia would be more happy about it than she was, because she had tried so hard. A little while later, Fiona approached the knights and saw that a lot of them had stopped coughing, which is good. The girl thought about what it would be like if she acted like that as Gabriella. Then she would have been very indifferent to the situation. After her marriage, she began to think how she could survive. She was very happy when she gave her heart to Ernst. Because of her hesitation, she could only approach Ernst after many attempts. She thought that he would not reciprocate her feelings. The girl was very afraid that he would find out about her feelings, and she was very worried that he would become greedy and she would lose him in the end. Looking at the knights, she thought the same thing had happened to them. At first, she was afraid to approach them because they saw her as a temporary duchess, but she knew better than to treat them kindly. She was the Duchess of Eccles, and she should do what she could to help them. Fiona smiled and said that she would bring more tomorrow, not so much because there was very little honey left. So Fiona firmly decided that she was so sorry and regretted that she had wasted too much time on realization and doubt she would never do it again. When suddenly Fiona saw someone sitting alone on a log. When the girl looked closer, she recognized him as Christian, Major Christian Bellemere. She had first seen him when he was 17. He's grown and matured. All the guards are special to her, but 5 stand out. Ernst's most trusted comrades. They are Sebastian, who has become her friend, Christian Bellemere, a member of the Bellemere family known for his loyalty. Vice Admiral Valken Tortes, Ernst's aide, a gay and Aeguus always making her smile. And the bravest Brynhilde Netto. She missed them as much as she missed Ernst. Fiona walked over and sat down on the log beside Christian. She said hello and smiled at him, but the guy felt uncomfortable with her sitting next to him. The girl waved her hand at him, saying, "Your Highness." She thought she couldn't believe that this child had grown up so much. He was now older than she was. But Christian was not good-natured. He told her to stop following them and go back to the carriage. The boy got off the log and stepped aside. Then Fiona realized that it wasn't going to be easy to earn their trust. Then Fiona thought of something. She said, "Major Bellemere." The guy turned and asked how she knew his last name. He didn't remember telling her. Fiona stood up from the log, adjusting her dress, and said yes. Hopefully they'll still have time to get to know each other, but heading towards the major and passing him, Fiona said that it was not necessary to show her contempt so openly. She said it's none of the officer's business. The major freaked out and said, "How dare she?" dropping his plate of food on the ground. When Fiona stepped away from the major, the girl laughed. She thought he was reacting the same way he did in his previous life. So funny to pester him. All he's changed is his relationship with her. But if he hasn't changed, he's still thinking about what he said. He's not the kind of guy to take things lightly. If he sees her as a threat, he'll tell Ernst and Sebastian. He's probably just testing her now. He's considering whether she's a threat. Now they'll be watching her even more closely. But that's what she's waiting for. Wants Christy to watch her even more. Christian used to follow her everywhere. If her plan doesn't work, he might recognize her as Gabriella. And even if she doesn't find out, And even if Ernst doesn't change his mind about her, and even if she and Ernst don't fall in love, it doesn't change the fact that she's still the Duchess of Eccles. Everyone in the north has their own ocean. Their job is to illuminate it. But it's still in darkness, and there are still footprints in the sand. Looking back and realizing how far you've come, and telling yourself that it's enough. The next sunny day a voice called out, "Princess! Princess, get up!" All these days, Princess Fiona slept in the carriage, not in a tent like everyone else. Again, the voice of Princess Get-Up has begun. It was a man's voice. Fiona knew that the forces of day and the forces of night, now that the forces had united, the rebellion could not be avoided. She had been waiting for this. Fiona got up and went to the window. She asked what happened. There was a guy standing on the street side. He said his name was Gehan, and he was in charge of the transportation of provisions. If the northern troops come and demand that they share their food supplies immediately, you think they'll be the first to leave port and load it on a ship. Because the northern fleet is terribly stupid and narcissistic. Fiona thought he was stupid and narcissistic. He thinks she's on the side of the forces of the day? Fiona said, could he give her? But Ian interrupted her and told her, listen, he's sure this man doesn't care about you. Your job is to preserve the Emperor's provisions. You can't give it away so easily. You listen to him. Fiona listened to the whole conversation, and she knew he would say that expectedly. She realized that he wanted the northern soldiers to beg for food. If you give them half the food, they won't do anything. The third prince doesn't even do business with him. This is a chance for her, a growth opportunity for the Emperor's crony. Gehan told Fiona to come out and talk to him. Just looking at him from the window isn't enough. The girl opened the carriage door and came out and said, what do we do? They seem to have a tough job ahead of them. Gehan thought about what this fool was talking about. This is an important matter, entrusted to him by the Emperor. This is his chance to succeed and strengthen his position. After all, he is the Emperor's nephew. Why does looking at her make his stomach turn, he thought. Some kind of trick. Going closer to her, he said, Madam, he thought she was too young for such questions. Then Fiona said, maybe it's too much. But how dare he insult her husband's army? And furthermore, don't you dare mention the Emperor's honor. You seem to think you're a monarch yourself. Fiona turned around and walked away, saying it was the first time she'd ever seen such a careless man. That's what's so disgusting about him. He should go back to the palace. Gehan's gonna scream. Who is she to say that? Fiona asked what is he doing judging her, and then added that she didn't even want to see his companions. She thought she was going to faint. She wants him to leave immediately, or her brother will be furious if anything happens to her. At that moment, Fiona saw that Christian was nearby. She put her hand to her forehead and said she didn't feel well. Christian stepped closer and was approached by Gehan, who said he hoped the clerk would make their conversation more pleasant. Gehan also turned to Fiona. She shouldn't be such a sissy just because she doesn't like someone. When Christian heard the word wimpy, he was furious. He said he's in charge of moving the provisions now. He poked a guy standing next to him with his finger. The guy asked if he meant him. Christian said yes. Doesn't he want to? The guy yelled that of course he does. He's much better. Gehan said no one dare stand in his way. He's a close associate of the Emperor. Yeah, the guy who was chosen to be the new caterer said to leave. Didn't he hear what the princess said? He's in charge now. The guys got into a scuffle and started fighting and trying to figure out who was in charge. Fiona thought everything was going perfectly, according to her plan for a couple of days. She'd been handing out tea and honey, observing people and their relationships, figuring out who hated who, finding rivals, and this was the result. Suddenly, Sebastian came up from behind and said, how much more interesting. Fiona turned and saw him. She recognized him as Sebastian, but she couldn't tell him yet. They hadn't met. He smiled a sincere smile and wished her good morning, ma'am. Then he introduced himself, saying his name was Sebastian Dessen and he was an officer in the Northern Fleet. Maybe he could help her clean up this mess. Fiona smiled and said, yes, do whatever you want. She realized that he must have been looking at her for a long time, but she was still glad to see him with her. And now she asked him to forgive her. She had to leave. Sebastian said the princess shouldn't witness such a spectacle, when suddenly Fiona saw Ernst. He came up to her, and all the knights saluted and said, Your Highness, they were pleased to welcome him. Fiona immediately came over and said she was fine. The soldiers protected her. Ernst said yes, of course. Fiona realized that he seemed to already know. She said that the soldiers came to her aid as soon as the conflict with the Gehan began. Replied that, however, the princess must not witness such events. Follow him and he will take her home. Fiona took hold of his cloak and stopped. His boyfriend turned around and asked Princess what was wrong. When the girl replied that she wouldn't move until the man who pointed his finger at the Gehanam left. The girl realized that to improve her relationship with Ernst, who doesn't even say her name, she had to show her side. And to do that, she had to get rid of the forces of the day without a drop of regret. Gehan, lying on the ground because he had a scuffle with his cousin, reached out to Ernst and said that there had been a misunderstanding about how they could choose his cousin. Ernst walked over to the Gehan lying on the earth, drew his sword and thrust it into his hand. He said, "Listen carefully now, he is no longer in charge of provisions. All workers will be eliminated." The entire crew said, "Yes, Your Highness." Ernst said it was a good way to keep the enemy in his place, but there was no need to do anything unnecessary. It was understandable. He turned to Fiona. Ernst drew his sword and approached Fiona as close as he could afford. The girl thought it was a perfect line, but remembered his words that he didn't want her to do anything. When suddenly there was a shout. No, it was the maid Sonia. "Get out of the crowd of soldiers." She jumped on Gihan and started yelling that he was a jerk. Grabbing him by the scruff of the neck, she shook him with all her might. The maid shouted for him to return the princess's hairpin immediately. No man in the world would trade an emerald hairpin for a jar of honey. Fiona smiled and thought, "Oh my goodness." Ernst asked what the hairpin was. The maid replied, "A jar of honey for a precious piece of jewelry." The princess asked to prepare tea with honey for the soldiers. She asked for honey, and this one came and said he wouldn't give it to her. The princess took out an emerald hairpin to get the honey. The soldiers started talking about how expensive it was to drink tea with honey. They can't even believe it's that expensive. Emerald hairpin. I'm surprised she used jewelry, such a sensitive gesture. How dare he really deceive such a kind princess who sacrificed her jewelry for a jar of honey? Ernst said that a man who disrespected the princess was sentenced to death, and he also heard that soldiers with colds were being given tea and honey. He's grateful. Then Ernst said that if she needed anything, she should ask him first. Fiona replied that no, she didn't want to alarm him and disturb him. Ernst replied that she didn't bother him at all and could safely address him. Fiona replied, "Good." Ernst went away on business, and the girl stayed behind. She began to think again that he must realize that it was her. Gabriella asks him to recognize him, but she can't say it out loud. But she speaks in her mind. Huge ships loaded with goods and food for the soldiers. Sebastian said half. That's how many soldiers he drove out, and that's just the ones the Emperor sent away personally. Circumstances are clearly not on their side. Sebastian also emphasized that it's surprising, but it seems their non-soldiers favor the princess. Yeah, I guess bosses often take advantage of their position to control the weaker ones. On the other hand, isn't it refreshingly hard to have honey tea? Ernst turned and asked if he too. Sebastian answered that exactly. Well, he seems to have changed for the better too, hasn't he?